Hey everyone, and welcome to my channel. I am Priyanka, a writer, researcher, and mystic. And in today's video, we are going to take a look at the current geopolitical scenario through the lens of occult wisdom and conspiracies. So, as we know, we are in the midst of a possibly escalating war between Iran and the US, and we are also seeing an intensifying energy crisis as a result of this war. And if you also just analyze the major patterns that we see playing out in the world today, we are seeing an increasing push for digitization, surveillance, and an overdevelopment of artificial intelligence. So, if from a conspiracy point of view, we have to label where the world is headed today, we can say that we are moving towards a dark technocratic order. So, this dark technocratic order is basically the death of whatever democracy we have left in society, and this push to replace the governments of different nations or completely bring them under the grip of these corporate and tech overlords who want to establish a techno-feudal state with an increasing class divide between the elites and the rest of the masses, and bring us under complete surveillance and make everything digitized so that they can limit and give us conditional human rights. And this dark technocratic order has always been known in conspiracy circles as the New World Order or the Great Reset. And you just have to Google these terms and you'll find countless manifestos, documents, and various world leaders mentioning these terms. And you'll also get to see what plans they have. The only difference is that they will place these plans and sell them as if they're for our own benefit. But when you really read between the lines, you see that they're actually trying to bring in this dark enlightenment. And that's the twisted play of the dark forces, right? They will always tell us what they intend to do to us because it is their own interpretation of the law of karma that if they tell us what they're doing to us and we don't listen and we don't retaliate and we're blindly following them, that means they can evade some of the bad karma that they get from this. So we already see that their plans are slowly coming to fruition with this increasing lack of privacy, increasing censorship, and this push to give everyone these digital IDs. And bit by bit, they are bringing all of our data on these digital platforms, and the eventual goal is to connect your entire identity to this digital ID so that they can track everything from your movement to how much money you have to where you're spending your money. And if in the future, as we will have more tyranny, you decide to disobey them, then they can control your human rights and they can limit what you're able to do and limit your lifestyle. And we're also seeing the establishment of these data centers all over the world, and they are the key to bringing in artificial intelligence. So first of all, they eat up a lot of energy, and these data centers are how they are collating all of the data and training their different artificial intelligence technologies. And along with this, we are seeing the implementation of the smart cities project, and a lot of these plans come under this project, and there is this bid to basically make everything artificial. So whether it's genetically modifying our food or whether it's literally artificially tampering with the weather or creating this push for an overdevelopment of different technologies and AI, and selling this narrative that eventually AI is going to become so powerful that humans will have to merge with machines. That means we will have to become artificial and transhumanist to compete with AI. So in this video, we are going to see how the current geopolitical chaos, the war between US and Iran, and what's going on with nuclear energy, and this AI Cold War between China and the US, and how all of this is leading to an impending shift in the global economic order, which is predicated by making everything more digital and bringing in more surveillance. So first, let's understand that there are three dimensions to any war. There's the mainstream, then there's the conspiracy, and then we have the occult. If you're just going to look at the mainstream narrative of any war, then you are basically being served propaganda on a platter. And I'm not completely against mainstream news, because for people to actually read between the lines, we need the mainstream news. That's how we can even sort of configure what the conspiracies and the occult dimensions are. So when you move away from the mainstream towards the conspiracy, you are sort of hinging between propaganda and the truth. And when you get to the occult analysis is when you can say that you're actually getting to get into the mind of these evil forces and try to configure what their plans and ultimate intentions are. Because the elite are not just these regular corrupt people who are hungry for money and power, right? They are dark occultists. They perform black magic, and they are constantly in communion with the demonic hierarchies. So demons are basically these archetypal parasites for people who don't know, and they seek to feed on human beings, and they individuate through different human beings, and they are these very destructive impulses. And when we identify demons, we are basically identifying shadows, right? So when you do inner work and you identify your shadows, you are identifying the demon within you. So even on a collective level with their agendas, on an occult level, it is very important for us to identify what demons are they working it with for certain agendas. So when it comes to technology, AI, and the digitization of everything, the demon that they want to have complete control of the world is Ahriman. So in Zoroastrian cosmology, Ahriman is basically the antithesis of truth, light, and divine order. He is the ultimate personification of evil. So Ahriman can be associated with cold intellect, soulless domination, and this very mechanized form of control. This is not your regular demon of jealousy and gluttony. This is the demon that does not control through emotional manipulation, but instead it uses deception and systemic manipulation. So in the world, Ahriman shows up as this very materializing force which wants to preserve the physical world. It wants to preserve the 3D world. It does not want humans to get over this cycle of death and rebirth. It wants humans to stay frozen in this physical world. Hence, we see the obsession of the elite to make everything artificial. That means materialize everything, and also their obsession with staying young and possibly living forever by combining us with machines. And Ahriman is also a very dehumanizing force. So as we know, the elites absolutely lack any empathy, and if you want to deep dive into how much empathy they actually lack, you can check my video on the Epstein files and mind control. So we cannot even comprehend how much empathy they lack, and this is why people find it very difficult to believe that they have all of these plans and agendas, because it is an extremely dehumanizing and evil force that wants to create a transhumanist slave race out of the whole of humanity. And Ahriman is also the impulse of scientism. So as we see in the world today, the solution for everything is more science, and people, even though a lot of the world is moving towards spirituality, a huge part of it is also moving towards scientism. So whether it's your health issues or just optimizing yourself, a lot of people are just turning towards technology, and society has lost this wisdom that we in ourselves are literally the microcosm. We are superhuman, and the way we can compete with AI is through developing ourselves spiritually and clearing our traumas and developing these new organs of perception and becoming more and more psychic. And we can also see scientism and this very cold, intellectual, logical perception of the world in how we look at the cosmos. So even though people are acknowledging that the cosmos is not physical, we are seeing a rise in this belief that the cosmos is a simulation, that we are living in a simulation. So all of this just takes away from the pure spiritual wisdom of spiritual initiation through different spiritual hierarchies that basically expand through the cosmos. So we are really seeing this intense push for mechanical thinking. And the reason why it is important to identify a certain demon and identify its qualities and reflect on it, whether on a individual or collective level, is because when you identify a demon or a shadow, you actually draw power away from them on the spiritual plane, because then you're able to see them in their truth and they can no longer deceive you. And Elon Musk actually had a bit of a slip up at an MIT event when he said that with artificial intelligence, we are summoning the demon. You know, all of those stories where there's a guy with the pentagram and the holy water, and he's like, yeah, he's sure he can control the demon, but it doesn't work out. And I will talk more about the elites actually mentioning the Antichrist and working with demons in future videos, but this is just one instant. So to understand the dark occult, we have to cognize the entities they are working with, because how can we fight something when we don't understand it? So we really have to identify this occult darkness with precision, ask the right questions so that we can get the right answers, and see how their spiritual dynamics then transfer onto the material plane. So in this video, we are closely going to begin with looking at the consolidation of energy, resources, and land that is going on with the most powerful nations in the world, which is actually leading to this geopolitical chaos. Because to bring everything in this digital grid, the resources and the different energies, they have to be consolidated. So first, let's begin with understanding this with the Iran war. So as we know, the US and Israel have been pushing this narrative that they have attacked Iran because Iran is a nuclear threat. And Israel, at least going as far back as 2009, has been portraying Iran as a nuclear threat. But before they actually went to war, in February, they were almost arriving at peace talks. So this is a statement from a UK National Security Advisor, Jonathan Powell, who said that he was surprised by what the Iranians put on the table during the U.S.-Iran talks in Geneva in February, and they were very close to getting to a peace deal. Then there's a U.S. Director, National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, who testified at the Senate Intelligence Committee hearing that Iran's nuclear enrichment program was obliterated as a result of last year's strike, and they have made no efforts to try to rebuild their enrichment capability. So in 2025, the US also attacked Iran, and they allegedly obliterated all of their nuclear facilities. And while Iran has been portrayed as a nuclear threat, they have been defending themselves that we are only developing our nuclear energy for civilian purposes and we are not developing weapons. And if you don't want to take Iran's word, then even the International Atomic Energy Agency said that Iran is not developing nuclear weapons. And while they have been trying to portray Iran as the bad guy, the US has placed this demand that Iran has to give up their enriched uranium deposits, which is a raw material that is used to make nuclear energy. And since Iran is not agreeing to this, there is the resultant battle over the Strait of Hormuz. So the Strait of Hormuz is a strait which is a channel of the world's oil supply, and it handles at least 1/5 of the oil supply that goes to Asian countries. And China buys at least 90% of oil that Iran exports. So the US has placed a blockade on Iranian fleets and ships. Then as a result of that retaliation, Iran has been closing or partially closing and then opening the Strait of Hormuz and not allowing other countries to conduct their trade over the strait. So we're seeing this crisis and this chaos unfolding over the past few months, and we're only now beginning to see the effects through the energy crisis that we're facing in the world. So, considering all of this, there are two broad reasons that we can say why the US Israel faction has attacked Iran. One is to obviously consolidate the resources that Iran has. So, Iran is one of the top 5 nations which is rich in natural resources, and as we saw, they also want their uranium deposits which are used to make nuclear energy. And this is not something that is only recently planned, because the dark forces always play a long game. So in order to prepare for this attack on Iran, they first have to subdue the regions around Iran. So if you'll see, in the last 25 years, in the regions around Iran like Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, Pakistan, there have been a lot of invasions, sanctions, covert operations, and regime change efforts. So this is a pattern that we see in any neo-colonialist agenda, that they first have to destabilize the regions around that nation. And we will take a further look at the second reason, which is to have the supremacy over nuclear power and to also annoy China. But for now, we are going to segue into understanding what the US has really been up to with oil and trying to get different nations under this Technate of America. So, as we know, the US has been trying to also control Russian oil by imposing sanctions of Russian oil, and the US has dipped into its own reserves and it has become one of the largest exporters of oil in the world. But at the same time, we're seeing this really weird incidents popping up in the world since the war started. So at least a month since the war, we have seen at least 45 plus cases of global oil refineries or power plants catching fire or blowing up. And this is almost a 1800% jump from the 9 to 10 incidents that we used to see in a year. And the countries where we're seeing these incidents occur are Malaysia, Vietnam, India, Pakistan, Romania, and Russia. And the mainstream media is really just posing them as these incidents occurring in a vacuum, but I don't think there is any such thing as coincidences, and these incidents can also fall in this pattern of oil consolidation, and if they cannot consolidate it, they will destroy it. And we can also see the astrology around these events, because that clears some of our doubts and helps us understand what's going on in the world better. So when all of this chaos started in April, we had very interesting conjunctions. So we had a massive planetary stack, or a stellium. So a stellium is when many planets are in one sign. So we had Mars, Mercury, Saturn, and Neptune, along with the Sun, all in the sign of Aries. And Aries is the fire sign. It is very aggressive in its lowest expression. So Mars is the war planet and Saturn is a planet that wants to block it. So we really see this push and pull between Iran and the US, both of them really going all out and making these claims and giving ultimatums, and then we see nothing happening, or we see this push for a ceasefire, then we see nothing happening. So there is this intense aggressive energy, but then there's also the slowing down of things as if something is blocking it. So we can see this as these planetary energies sort of opposing and pulling on each other. And then we also have Neptune, which is a planet of oil, and Neptune is also the planet of deception. And then we have Mercury, which is the planet of markets and trades. So all of this in the fire sign of Aries is really mirroring the chaos that we are seeing in the world today. And apart from this, to really bring into context what the US dark state has been up to, we are going to take a look at this map of the Technate of America. So this map was created by the technocracy movement in the 1930s, and this movement had a lot of prominent people like Elon Musk's grandfather, and they wanted to create a society that is ruled by engineers and scientists. And this map actually shows the US, Canada, Mexico, Greenland, Central America, the Caribbean, and the northern tier of South America all merged into one continental zone. And their motivations for creating this range from securing access to different trade routes and natural resources. And on paper, this movement has died down. But if you actually see what has been happening in the past few years, their agendas have actually been advancing through different trade agreements, security partnerships, and crisis narratives under these different Silicon Valley technocrats, banking magnates, and the military industrial complex. So I'm just going to read out this chunk from from an article that I had written. So today, the US, Canada, and Mexico may act like arch enemies, but they are functionally linked through energy grids, supply chains, and security operations, whereas Central America and the Caribbean act as managed buffer regions that absorb economic stressors and are fraught with humanitarian and migrant crisis. Governance is maintained not through direct rule, but through the normalization of perpetual crisis management with NGOs and security frameworks. Lastly, Greenland may come under Denmark's purview, yet the US is allowed to have a base there. And as we know, Trump is already ramping up efforts to capture Greenland and has threatened sanctions against any European country that tries to stop him. A review of US interventions in Latin America reveals a near continuous sequence of corporate aligned takeovers, beginning in the early 1900s with Cuba and Panama. The pattern extends through Mexico, Guatemala, Cuba, again, Chile, El Salvador, Venezuela, Bolivia, and repeated incursions into Honduras, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Nicaragua, Panama, and Venezuela again in 2026, with the dramatic and possibly staged capture of Maduro, the president of Venezuela. And now the US controls their oil and other natural resources. So the dramatics and dynamics of conquest will look different for every country as they look different for Iran. And now let's move to understanding nuclear energy, and is this Iran war a way to also get to China? So there is this tiff between the Western European powers and the BRICS nations and other small nations to have supremacy over nuclear energy. And the leading nations in nuclear energy today are Russia and China. And the US actually gets a lot of its uranium for nuclear energy from BRICS and Kazakhstan imports. And because Russia and China are so powerful, the US tries to indirectly mess with them. So Russia, the US is very straightforward, but with China, the US is really careful. And only in the last few years, the European nations, so for example, the UK and also the US, they have been now focusing on developing their nuclear capacities. And we can see that the Iran war could be a way for the US to mess with China through this astrological alignment as well. So the Mars-Saturn conjunction, so we saw that stellium of planets. So in that, Mars and Saturn specifically fell in the 7 degrees of Aries. And in the Chinese chart, their sun falls in 7 degrees of Libra. So Aries and Libra are opposite signs in the zodiac. And when we see this opposing conjunction, you can imagine the two energies sort of being 180 degree apart and pulling against each other. So this signifies that China could come under some sort of a conflict, which it actually did. And there's a lot of speculation in the conspiracy community if US and China actually are just pretending to fight, or are they actually frenemies? Because we obviously cannot say they are just enemies. They are also friends in a lot of ways, because they cannot completely cut each other off from the different trade agreements that they have. And they also visit each other and they try to have these different peace talks and reconcile their relations. So to understand what is the relationship between US and China, I went looking for the prospect of any bloodline family to identify the dark state within China. So Fritz Springmeier has written this book on the 13 bloodline families of the dark forces, and he actually mentions the Li Bloodline, which is a Chinese bloodline. And he traces his bloodline as far back as to 2000 BC to Emperor Yuanshu. So that's how old all of these families of the dark state are. They are very ancient. And he also talks about the different occult and black magic practices that have been traced to this family and how they have established the Chinese intelligence in the 1400s. And during the time when he was writing this book in the 1990s, there were 3 Chinese families with the surname Li that were in prominent positions. So the billionaire and de facto ruler of Hong Kong, Li Ka-shing, Li Peng, the ruler of China, and Lee Kuan Yew, president of Singapore. And the Chinese place their surnames before their name. And he also mentions this really interesting statement that sort of gives us an idea between these power dynamics between the Chinese dark state and the US dark state. So he wrote, I don't know which of the Lees are closely related and which are not. I do know that Lee controls Red China, Hong Kong, Singapore, and has important positions in Taiwan. If the various Lees which control these various nations are related, then we are certainly looking at one of the most powerful families in the world. In terms of power, they would be just as powerful as the Rockefellers. And as we know in the conspiracy circles that it is a big deal to compare the power of any family to the Rockefellers. And Li Peng, who was a communist, would in fact make regular visits to New York City and meet the Rockefellers, who were capitalists. So while they would demonize China and all of these communists, the capitalists and communists were actually working together. And today, if we have to see, the Lees are one of the families that are actually pioneering artificial intelligence and technological development in China. So Li Ka-shing, who is a Hong Kong business magnate and investor, he runs Horizons Ventures, which is a company that invests in synthetic biology, biotechnology, and they have this lab known as Cortical Labs that is developing computing that combines AI with living brain cells. I don't think I need to say anything else over here. And Li Shufu, also known as Eric Li, is the founder and chairman of Shechiang Geely Holding Group. And they control brands like Volvo Cars, Lotus, and they are steering their empire in these automotors to combine them with artificial intelligence. Then Robin Li Yan Hong, he is the co-founder of and CEO of Baidu, which is basically China's Google, and he is also steering the entire company and all of their operations towards artificial intelligence. So now that we have some idea of how powerful China could be, let's examine the relationship between US and China and sort of question if US and China could be in this AI Cold War. And the best example of an hint of this Cold War is the AI Summit in India, where we had the best companies in AI from different parts of the world and of course majorly the Silicon Valley, but we did not have a single Chinese company. And placing this in context to how the relationship between US and China has changed in the past few years. So back in the 1990s and early 2000s, when they actually started developing these trade relations, US had a lot of pro-China policies under presidents like Bill Clinton. And it is also known that Henry Kissinger was very close to Chinese leaders, and he plays a huge role in pushing technological development in China. And today, China is literally the blueprint of a high-tech dystopia. And most of the people over there have actually lost their spiritual principles and are atheists. So while US and China were developing these relations, US developed a sort of a dependence on different Chinese trade operations like consumer goods or raw material for technologies. And China also had some sort of a dependence on the US. But China in the past few years really went all in developing its technology and nuclear power. So when the Trump administration came into power, we sort of saw this shift into anti-China policies. But the US really plays it very carefully with China because China is also really powerful, and that's why when we saw the recent visit of Trump with 17 other CEOs to China, it was not just this deal to resolve the war in Iran. It was for them to reconcile their relations, because what would be the need to take so many CEOs on that trip? And a lot of people are also sort of gauging that the US is actually bending in front of China. So we can see this changing dynamics in the different superpowers, but people also say that the US is having a downfall. I don't think the US is having a downfall, but we are seeing the emergence of China as a global superpower alongside the US. And another instance of how powerful China is that they literally don't have Google, YouTube, or Facebook. They have their own platforms, and these are the platforms through which US can actually track what's going on in different nations, and these are the platforms through which they actually collect data. And several other instances are, for example, this military leader Shang Yoshua was actually investigated for leaking China's nuclear secrets to the US. So I don't think there is a pretend war going on, but I also wouldn't say that they are completely against each other. I would say that they are frenemies. But regardless whether it is going to be this unipolar world order or multipolar world order, that means whether only the US gets to be the dominant country or whether it's US and China, the consequence for us is the same. We are still going to move towards this technocratic dystopia. But these changing geopolitical dynamics also are now hinting towards a changing monetary order. So as we know, the petrodollar has been struggling now because of the $1 trillion debt the US has and all of these sanction wars that the US has been imposing. And we are also seeing the BRICS nations flourishing. So we saw a similar thing when there was a change in the monetary order from the gold standard to the petrodollar system. So during that time, as the gold standard was dying and we knew that the US dollar can no longer back it, Henry Kissinger was forming these coups and having these informal agreements, and they got into an agreement with Saudi Arabia to become the dominant power that sells oil and to price your oil in dollars and to circulate that money back into the US Treasury. And at the same time, there was this war on oil sovereignty. That means if any nation does not agree to sell their oil in dollars, they would be invaded or taken down. And that's exactly what we also saw happening back then with Iran and Venezuela. And now history has been repeating itself as we're moving away from the petrodollar, but the US still wants to maintain its dominance. So we're seeing all of this geopolitical chaos with a shift in the monetary order. And there's also a very interesting astrological alignment which the astrologers actually have been waiting for since decades. So in February, we had the Saturn-Neptune conjunction in Aries in the degree of 0. So Aries is the beginning of the zodiac and 0 is literally the beginning. And when this happens, we see a change in the fundamental structures that sustain this world. And generally with the Saturn-Neptune conjunctions in any degree in Aries, we have seen the world witness major resets. So one was during the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And then the other was after the World War II era, when the entire geopolitics was being restructured in the world. But this 0 degrees Aries conjunction is actually very rare. And the last time we think we saw it was in 8128 BC, and these are not set in stone because it is very difficult to track the dates and track the planetary alignments going so far back in time and also placing the exact events that occurred during that time, but we do have some idea. So in 8128 BC, this was a time of the end of Ice Age and the beginning of farming. And as we know, humans discovering farming fundamentally change how we live and operate. And we have more evidence for the second one, which is 4631 BC, which was the beginning of the Sumerian civilization and the establishment of the first cities. We also developed new forms of writing, and they specifically got this cylinder seal, which was this instrument to authenticate transactions. It was the beginning of the first accounting system that changed how people trade with each other. So similarly, in the world today, with the Saturn-Neptune conjunction, we are seeing them crossing major thresholds in implementing a digitized economy with all of this geopolitical chaos. And the energy of this conjunction is going to last at least till the end of next year. So when I say a digital economy, for people who aren't familiar with conspiracies, we can see two major plans playing out here. It is the push for central banking digital currencies, which are these programmable central bank currencies, which will eventually be connected to your digital ID, and that will allow them to control where and how you spend your money and give them the power to just switch off your money. And second, we are also seeing this intense regulation of cryptocurrencies, and they have been pushing this agenda through different measures, right? So for example, we had COVID, which was completely orchestrated. And if you're interested, I have actually written a book on the dark state factions, their agendas, and how do they actually push their plans through the world. And I'm not going to mention my book's name because it has a certain I word in it, and I think the more I mention these words, the more they sort of also push down the video and censor it. So you can check out my book, where I have covered all of their major agendas and some events that have also happened in the past few years, and what is their pyramid control system, how do they actually control the world. So it is a really good summary to understand the dark state. So with COVID, they created this biosecurity state, which led to more lockdowns and everything going more and more digital. And now with this geopolitical chaos, we are seeing an escalation with a war security state. And again, we have slightly COVID-like measures, which is again pushing people to go more digital. And we can also see this with demonetization, which happened in India and several other countries, which was to reduce the cash flow in the economy and get everyone to be online. So the ultimate agenda is to create this convergence of technologies, get all of your data online, get you dependent on technology and addicted to it, and really create this digital control grid, which will then eventually be overseen by artificial intelligence. And that's it for today, guys. I hope this video was insightful. Please tell me in the comments what are your thoughts on this, and please like, share, comment and subscribe. And thank you so much for watching. I will see you soon.